Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're here with Brian Lamb, who is the founder, retired CEO, and executive chairman of C-SPAN, which has been going for 36 years, I believe, and we'll get into the founding of that. It's a remarkable story. And we'll talk about a lot of things, because Brian is an acute observer of Washington and the best interviewer I've ever seen. I suspect a lot of you have seen the interviews he's done over the years. And he is known for a very humble approach. He actually reads the books of people he interviews, and he tries to, as much as possible, not be the star of the show, making the interviewee the subject of attention. And that's what I'm going to try to do in my own way today. But first, please join me in just giving Brian some applause for coming today here. Born in 1941 in Indiana, 11 years old, you went to the inauguration of Dwight Eisenhower. Who took you and why?
My parents. I had an uncle who lived in Washington. He was a lawyer. He was the brother of my father, and in some strange way became the chairman of the float committee for the Eisenhower inaugural parade. And so he invited his brother out and the family, and we got on my first airplane ever and flew to Washington. Actually, no, that's not true. We flew out of Washington to Florida. We came in on the train because there was a huge accident at Union Station where the train from Baltimore lost its brakes and ran all the way into the concourse. Wow. And dumped into the, just as we're getting in on the lower track, dumped into the train station, and fortunately no one was killed, but that was my entrance to Washington, a train wreck.
An exciting time. It happens all the time, I suspect, train wrecks at Union Station.
All the time, every day.
That's the experience you had. So, and then what do you remember from the inauguration itself?
Not much. I just remember being somewhat dazzled by the fact that I was in Washington. I was only 11, so I didn't really comprehend it all. And I remember I thought my uncle was a big deal. And that's about all I remember.
Okay. Now, you listen to radio, I understand, a lot. Listen to talk radio shows from Chicago, and they often put you to sleep. They are sometimes said to have an exciting impact, but for you it was a sedative. Why?
I don't really remember why I started listening to radio, but it was really early, and I built a little crystal set that didn't cost more than a piece of wood and a little crystal to listen to the local radio station. And the odd thing is that I'm now significantly older than that, and I still listen to the radio the same way. I had a little earpiece at the time, and last night I was listening to radio in the middle of the night, and I still have an earpiece. So it's something that I started when I was young. I actually don't listen to put myself to sleep. I listen because I want to learn something, but you know, at that time of night, often you fall asleep and you don't have any control over it. So I think it's osmosis. If it keeps on playing, that I'm hoping for, so I pick up some new information.
Sort of the way to learn foreign languages, by learning them while you're asleep rather than having to study.
Yeah, well, foreign languages and I never got along very well, so I don't know that would even have helped me.
So you've been quoted as saying, I always asked questions because that was the way I learned. You just asked people questions directly. At age 13, I went into a radio station in Lafayette, Indiana, and said, "Can I come in?" And then you began asking questions of the disc jockey. That takes a lot of confidence to do that at age 13. Where did that come from?
I don't know that it was confidence so much as I didn't know any better. And I love the idea of radio. And so the fact that a disc jockey in this small radio station would take the time to show me how he did his job, I thought was pretty neat stuff. And that was probably the first time I really saw radio up close. And he let me, I mean, this sounds simple, but he let me cue the record. And in those days, you had a record. You had a vinyl, 33 1/3. And that was a big deal for me. I thought that was exciting. That's how I started my radio career.
And then you actually started interviewing some people on the radio, right? At age 17, you had a job at the station doing interviews of some very famous people.
a man named Henry Rosenthal, who was the part owner of the radio station and the general manager, knew that I wanted to get into radio, and he actually hired me out of high school for $1 an hour to just be there, filing records, doing whatever they told me to do. He knew I wanted to go on the air, and one day he said to me, "Would you like to make a station break tonight?" And I said, "I'd love to." And that sounds like, again, a very insignificant thing, but at the time, it was a big deal. So at 7 o'clock at night, I got to tell the world of Lafayette, Indiana, what the name of the radio station was. And
how would you do that?
I would say, "This is WASK Radio, 1450 on your dial, Lafayette, Indiana."
Okay.
And that was the first thing I did on the radio. And then after that, he gave me a half-hour radio show to play records. And then we started a program at one of the local parks in the summer where we did a 2-hour nightly radio show and attracted young people to come out to the park.
Okay. And you had an audience there, the people would actually be standing and you were spinning the records. What was the scene like?
We had actually built a mobile unit and put a couple of, and in those days there were 45 records. Not 45 in number, but 45 RPM. Small records, about that big. And we put 2 turntables inside the van, put a big speaker on the outside, located near a food stand, and spun the records for 2 hours from 7 to 9. We called it Summer in the Park. And as folks would come along and young people, I'd interview them on the spot for the local audience.
And would people be dancing? And
Not there.
Not there.
But one of the ways I learned how to put some more money in my pocket was to do record hops. That's what they called them then. I don't know what they call them now. I'd hate to think what they call them now, but I would go out to a school, or we used to have a teenage nightclub in downtown Lafayette where kids would come. Obviously no alcohol served, but we would spin records. And that was all part of trying to earn enough money, frankly, to pay for college.
So who was Dick Clark?
Dick Clark was one of the great entrepreneurs in the history of our medium of television. He used to have a daily show on a Philadelphia television station. I think it was WFIL. I'm not positive about that, but I think that was the name of it. And it was a 1-hour show, and he would have kids in from the Philadelphia neighborhoods to dance. He would spin the records. It was that simple. And invite a lot of stars to come by, and he made people by appearing on his show into very popular figures. They'd come on and they'd mimic their records.
Because it went national, and then of course he amazingly looked youthful for decades.
Actually, almost to the end of his life.
Yeah.
Now, I'll never forget meeting him in person once in my life, and he was probably in his 70s at the time. Or maybe in his 60s, but he looked like he was about 35, and I met his wife, and she had naturalized, stayed gray, and the two of them together didn't make any sense.
She looked like his mother?
That would be unfair to her, but she looked older than he did.
So, and you may have seen him because he would do New Year's Eve things for many years. And so was he your role model?
You know, I don't think so much as what he did excited me. And I talked the local television station manager into letting me do a show like that for a local audience. We started out on a daily basis. It really wasn't very popular, and it didn't do that well. And we moved it to only one, instead of a half hour every day, we moved it to an hour on Friday afternoons. And it lasted a year or so, but it was really hard, frankly, on a local basis to get people to come out, get young kids to come out, especially on a Friday afternoon when the only thing they really cared about was the basketball game during the basketball season. So,
right, Indiana.
Even in Indiana, I shouldn't say even in Indiana. Indiana used to be all basketball all the time. Of course, it's not nearly as significant there as it used to be, but it was, especially in high school, it's a big deal.
And you interviewed some very prominent people, Louis Armstrong, for example. What do you remember about that?
Well, what I remember most about being at this small station is that Purdue University, where I went to college, was located there. And they used to have the best entertainment there was in the United States to this fabulous Hall of Music that they have there was over 6,000 seats. And on a Friday or a Saturday night, they'd have these big shows, and kids could go, and the local townspeople could go to these shows. Well, I'd try to pick these folks off when they would come to town for an interview, and was relatively successful. Some of the bigger names that came in were people like Nat King Cole, who I did get to interview, and that was, he didn't live very long. I think he ended up having throat cancer. He was a smoker. But Gordon McCrae, who's an old Broadway actor, came to town. And when I have a show on a Saturday morning, I just pick up the phone and call the hotel on campus and ask for the name of the person who was entertaining. And they'd ring the room, and if they answered, I'd say, "I'm on the radio. Would you like to talk with me?" And they didn't have much choice unless they wanted to be very rude, and they never were.
So that's where you started with interviewing. Was your style of interviewing then, much as it became, in a way, a minimalist style?
It must have been. I don't really remember. I've got some old audio tapes of that. But I was taught by a fellow in my high school how to interview. And he taught the basics and said you should stay simple and basic and do the who, what, why, where, when, and how questions that people ask in journalism. And I always thought he was right about that. It changed in our business a great deal to what it is today, where the interviewer is expected to be much more involved and much more opinionated. But I think probably I was the same back then. I haven't gone back to listen to any of those tapes in a long time, but I know I never was much a part of the interview itself.
Now, what did you have in common with Ringo Starr?
Not much, except I was a drummer. Mm-hmm. And actually, the Beatles were not my favorite group growing up. I don't remember, again, why they weren't, but I wasn't as fond of them as I was a lot of the other groups. I got to be very fond of some rhythm and blues groups because there was a radio station out of Nashville called WLAC, and they sold records on something called Randy's Record Shop, Buckley's Record Shop, Ernie's Record Shop, and these were the original mail-order record shops. And as kids in my hometown, we would listen there because the music was so much different than what we were used to in Lafayette, Indiana. But I started out when I was about 10 playing the drums. And again, when I went to high school, I played the drums all through high school. And then college, it was another thing that I could use in order to make money to help pay for tuition, which, by the way, in those days wasn't very much.
So your parents took you to the Eisenhower inaugural. They put up with your drumming for years. I mean, sounds like good parents.
They bought me my first drum.
So, and they didn't regret it later, or?
They never said they did. They might have.
Okay.
I would have if I'd have been them.
So if there were a counterfactual history, is there a history where Brian Lamb would become a drummer for Merle Haggard, or?
That would have been a kick. I don't know. I don't know that I was that good. I never learned how to read music. Okay. I loved the entertainment business. I could have very easily become an entertainer instead of what I did if certain things hadn't happened. I mean, the Navy came along, and I did that after school, and that changed everything. But I love the entertainment part of it. I love being in a band, and I was in all kinds of bands. Dixieland, rock and roll, big band, all that.
What was your favorite kind of music, and is it still your favorite kind of music?
I don't know that I have a favorite kind of music. I listen to everything now except opera and probably rap, which I've never been that fond of. But when I was growing up, I think my favorite kind of music was probably rock and roll. Today, it's a toss-up between Latin, country music, and I still love big band.
Okay. You were in the Navy then for 4 years, right? Two at sea and 2 in Washington, where you became an aide to Lyndon Johnson.
It was not as big as it sounds. I was a social aide
to
Lyndon Johnson, but I was a full-time employee of the Navy and worked inside the Pentagon and got this fabulous opportunity from time to time to be called to the White House to be basically an extension of the first family, or probably more or less part of the service crowd. I mean, there were 25 of us, and only about 6 or 7 to 10 worked any one particular event. and we were responsible for keeping everything running. We weren't that important, but it did give us a chance to observe President Johnson for a couple years, which was really, he was a very interesting man to observe.
What was the most interesting thing?
I don't think probably, you look back, and I've been fortunate to interview several presidents, and I never interviewed him, but looking back on him, he was probably the most engaged of all the presidents I've ever seen. Certainly Bill Clinton was engaged and always talking to people directly and trying to convince them of his position. But I've probably interviewed Bill Clinton 6 or 7 times, but never was around him like I was around Lyndon Johnson. And he was there in the middle of what he called guns and butter. We had the Vietnam War was going at full speed, which was very difficult for the country at the time. And he also was trying to pass the civil rights laws and Medicare and things like that. So there was a tremendous amount of government that he was responsible for at the time, and being able to see that up close was significant for me.
And you started going over to Congress at times and just listening to the debates. Is that?
I would wander in at night when there weren't many people there into the House of Representatives or the Senate and just sit there and watch it. Not because I was an expert, because I wasn't an expert, and I wanted to see what it was like up close. And I would do that, from time to time. Yeah.
When you saw what it was like up close, was that encouraging or discouraging?
I don't think it was either. I think it was just educational. I did know that it was a bit rowdy at nights and there were no cameras there at the time, and there weren't many people in the galleries, and it was a lot more rowdy than it is now. I mean, there was, without being disparaging about our Congress, there was a lot more drinking going on around Congress in those days, at least that you could see. I'm not sure what it's like today, but you can't see it today. But in those days, it wasn't surprising when you would see somebody who was a little tipsy walking around at night. There was a lot of backroom partying going on, and that may be unfair because they all weren't like that, but I at least observed some of that when I was there.
So I hear references sometimes to that period as if it were a golden age of everyone getting along, as opposed to sharp partisanship, and I have a hard time believing that. I mean, did you see sharp partisanship there? Did you see personal attacks going on?
It was very, very partisan at the time in a different way than it is now, because you had a Democratic Party, for instance, that had both far left people and far right people in it. Mm-hmm. And you had some of the same in the Republican Party with the Jacob Javits type senators from and Barry Goldwater in the party at the same time. So it wasn't as nasty per se as it is now, which has probably been brought about by more exposure, but it was very definitely partisan, and it wasn't, people didn't get along that much. There was nothing nastier than the civil rights fight, mm-hmm. because you had people like Richard Russell, who was basically a white separatist, fighting Hubert Humphrey, who wanted a civil rights bill that would open the whole process up to everybody in the country. And it was tough, and it was not pleasant. But you didn't see that much of it in those days because there was no television coverage of it, to be honest.
Yeah. And at one point you were dispatched to Detroit to report on what was going on there with the riots?
I was in the service in the Pentagon, and back in July of 1967, there were these horrible riots in Detroit in which 43 people were killed and several hundred wounded. And they sent in the 82nd Airborne. And because it was so political, and George Romney was running for president at the time, at least they thought he was going to run for president, he was the governor of Michigan, that the president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, wanted somebody to keep watch on everything he said there. And I was not the slightest bit political, but they came to me because I had I was a lieutenant junior grade in the Navy, and they told me to get on an airplane in civilian clothes, take my tape recorder, go out to Detroit, and record everything that George Romney said in public, and then feed it back to the White House Situation Room. They transcribe it and send it up to the President of the United States so that he could see what he thought was going to be his opponent at the time, see what he was talking about in the middle of all these riots, because the president had to order in the 82nd Airborne, so it was very, very tense and political.
So you just basically were shadowing Romney during that whole period? And
it wasn't that simple, because he would come to the headquarters of the chief of police in the city building to give his news conferences, and that's basically where I would pick up what he had to say in his news conferences. The thing that was interesting about that trip for me was I was in a room that was very small. It probably wasn't much bigger than that corner over there, and they had in that room some very famous people. I was the gopher. I was the guy that cleaned the floor, because they didn't have anybody in the building that was cleaning the place out every day. So I was sweeping the place out and keeping it clean. But they had the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Cyrus Vance, who went on to be Secretary of State. They had John Doerr, who went on to be the prosecutor for the House of Representatives in the Watergate case. They had a fellow named Roger Wilkins, who was the nephew of Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP. And they had Warren Christopher, who at the time was a deputy attorney general, and he eventually became the attorney general, and then he became Secretary of State. And at the time, I was just in that room answering the phones and keeping the place clean and doing whatever they told me to do. But I had no idea that all of these people were going to go on to be as important as they were.
But your job was not to report on them. It was all Romney all the time?
My job was to not do anything with them. And as a matter of fact, they were on the Johnson team. So the last thing I would do would be report back on anything that they were doing. And they weren't doing anything nefarious. It was quite a distinguished group. And it was very, very enjoyable seeing them work up close.
Okay. So in the 70s then, you've been learning a lot about Washington, and you basically want to show the country what you were seeing? Is that the genesis of the idea for C-SPAN?
No, close. But the genesis was that it seemed to me, just as a Midwesterner from a small town, when I got to Washington, there was a lot that we weren't seeing on the evening news at night, and the evening news at night was the most significant news that we had in the country. It was 30 Minutes, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And they basically said the same thing on all three networks. Same stories, same lead stories. Often a couple of days apart, they'd have the same feature stories. And it seemed to me that there should be a way for us to see more of the town. And I just kind of grew into watching a new industry come alive called cable. And as it came alive and the satellites began to be launched in the United States for use, there became a way that you could do programming that had never been seen before by people, because the commercial television stations were pretty much the same all the time. And that's how I found out about it and saw it grow and got involved and wanted to do something to change the kind of information that was available on television. It wasn't on my part a bit sophisticated. I didn't really particularly know what I was doing, but I was watching and learning and trying to figure out how to fit in, and that's how I got involved.
And of course, the late 60s and the early 70s, the years of the Vietnam War, which ended in 75, C-SPAN started in 79. Any connection between those events and just in your own thinking about why it was important to do C-SPAN?
Yeah, I thought the Vietnam War was covered in a somewhat unbalanced way. Mm-hmm. I don't mean to imply for a minute I thought it was the right thing to do, but the media changed. They were very much for the war in the beginning, and then almost the same way it happened in Iraq, they were for it in the beginning, and then they turn on it. And when they begin to turn on it, often the balance is not there. And I thought that for instance, CBS was the one responsible for this back in the Vietnam War. They concentrated only on the J.W. Fulbright, senator from Arkansas, who was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, on his hearings. And that's all we ever saw, and they were pretty much conducted in a way that was very much anti-Vietnam at the time, and we didn't get any kind of a balance. And I think as I saw that happen, and I saw the way they covered the Pentagon, it just seemed to me that there was more to it than the way we saw the news in the evening, and that's one of the impetuses for getting involved as I did.
So, because you wanted balance and want balance, you're sometimes described as a conservative, but that's a label you don't want. From what I've read, is that if you had to describe yourself in one word, how would you do that?
Totally independent.
Okay.
I mean, I've never been a member of a party, even though I worked in the Nixon administration, I worked around the Johnson administration, I worked on Capitol Hill. I just never found myself to have an ideology, and frankly, when you get into the media business, and if you've decided that you want to be unbalanced unbalanced, if you want to be balanced and objective, and that's really hard to do, you need to extract yourself from being involved with the issues, or you won't realize how much you favor one side or the other. And it's easy to do. I mean, I have a great deal of sympathy for people in the business. They think they're being objective, fair, and balanced, but frankly, they all have feelings, they all have ideas, and I'm always surprised when people in the journalism world will register in one party or the other. It seems to me that you ought to stay, I think you ought to vote, but you ought to stay away from the party situation and being on a side. And I just have never been on one side or the other, and don't consider myself to be anything. And I'm the one guy that can get away with it. It doesn't really matter. People always get upset when they say, well, you got to be on a side. And I say, well, just let me be me, let me be in the middle, let me not be involved. And you go ahead and think whatever you want to. That's fine for you. Be on a side. That's what you should do.
Well, if a reporter is on a side, why not register Democratic or Republican? Isn't that the honest thing to do at that point?
Yeah, I wish they'd tell us when they're reporting, though, along the way, that which sides they're on. I really like it the way it is now. When I tune in a Fox or an MSNBC, I know what side they're on. Not always. I mean, but you
Sure.
pretty much know what side they're on, and it's fine with me. I just deal with it. People get all upset today. I mean, a lot of people in journalism, and I think they started believing their own press releases, in the sense that back in the early days of television news, because the Federal Communications Commission required news on the part of television stations, they required them to do 10% of their programming in public affairs. They required them to be so-called fair and balanced. They convinced themselves that they were that way, even when they weren't. And I think they tricked themselves into thinking that they were always doing the right thing. And journalism is an exciting business. I love the profession, but I'd rather people almost tell me what they think, if they think strongly about something, than not.
Did the fairness doctrine bring about fairness?
It did not. Fairness doctrine, in my opinion, was ridiculous, awful, made no sense. You can't put one human being in the Federal Communications Commission responsible for something called fairness and disseminate only what he thought were important issues to the rest of the commission, and even the rest of the commission, which is sitting there, at the time it was 7 members, 4 on one side, 3 on the other. You're not necessarily going to get a fair shake on the fairness doctrine. And frankly, with the fairness doctrine, you got very little controversy on a lot of stations because they were afraid to step over the line. The best thing about not having a fairness doctrine is that you've got talk radio, you've got left-wingers and right-wingers, and they can say whatever they want to, and they don't have to worry about the other side. And I would much rather have it that way than have something called the fairness doctrine, which really wasn't fair.
So over the years, you've interviewed so many people. And by the way, those interviews are all available on the internet. You can just Google Brian Lamb, and you'll see a lot of it, or C-SPAN and go through those files, and they're really fascinating. Let me just mention a couple of them that I was looking at. 10 years ago, and you did several of these, but 10 years ago, an interview with then President George W. Bush, where you asked what he was reading, and he talked about Oswald Chambers with his famous devotional book, and Bush says, "Last year I read Oswald Chambers every day, and this year I'm reading the Bible every day." And then I was really surprised by your next question, because your next question was, can I ask you about indecency? Why not a follow-up on the Bible?
Flawed. I was just, I don't know at the time. Actually, at the time when I asked that question, people knew he read the Bible every day. I should have asked him more about the Bible. I knew, and he also had, as you say, the book that he read before that, there was a religious message that he would read every day to get his day started. Sometimes you're sitting there thinking, I've only got 25 minutes and I want to keep moving. But that would have been a very good question. I could have gone down that route very easily.
I've seen many interviews with people I know are strong Christians. It's really important to them, and I just see such a shying away from so many journalists to go down that road. We just don't want to go there. So
I actually would love going down that road because I think you learn a lot about people when they're willing to talk about if they're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever it is, or atheist. You learn a lot about them. I mean, I interviewed a lot of Christopher Hitchens and talking about his atheism and all. And I probably did the last television interview with him where people kept praying for him. And he said, go ahead and pray for me, but it's not going to change me. I'm not going to have a deathbed conversion. But we'll never know whether he had a deathbed conversion. But he was very willing to talk about it all the time.
Yeah. Just want to mention this interview went on where you asked, the longer you're in this White House with all those that have gone before you, do you see ghosts of past presidents? And Bush said, well, I quit drinking in '86. So anyway, and then he said, I mean, do you feel the history of this place? And then it went on. So are there I enjoyed reading that rejoinder by Bush. Are there other memorable rejoinders or ones that you particularly think of, answers to questions?
Well, one of the reasons that I came over today was because of the interview that I had done with you 20 years ago.
20 years ago, yeah.
And I remember this story so well because I had been down to the Atlanta Zoo to interview Newt Gingrich right after the Republican Party had won the House of Representatives, and he was going to be the speaker. And he was a great promoter of books. And after the interview was over, I can still remember the place where we were walking out of the zoo, and it was the same day that he had announced that he wasn't going to take his $4.5 million advance for the book that he had written, and people, the media was all over him for that. And we were walking down the path out of the Atlanta Zoo, and I asked him, what is a book now that you're reading that you would like to promote? And he brought up a man named Marvin Olasky. And when I got back to Washington, he was always very excited about books. I went to the bookstores trying to find your book, and none of the bookstores had it. So I got on the phone and called around and found it at a Christian bookstore out by Dulles Airport on a Saturday afternoon. I drove by myself out there in the rain, and I remember buying 4 copies because I knew this book was going to take off if Newt Gingrich was promoting it.
That probably exhausted the whole first printing.
Well, and then we called you up and said, would you come in and do the book notes interview? And you did, and that's how you and I met, which I always love that story because people always want to know, how do you get these books? And you get them in the strangest places at the strangest times.
Well, and just about all interviewers, certainly on radio, don't read the books. It's very rare that an interviewer will actually read the book. Sometimes there's a press release associated with it, and there'll be a list of potential questions, and just read off the questions, which is very boring for the interviewee. So I appreciate you're doing that.
The problem with that is that some of those questions are really good that they write in those press releases, and you end up sometimes asking the same questions. But I always worry about the interviewee who is on a book tour and they have been interviewed 10 times and they're really tired of the same old questions.
Right.
And so sometimes, and I work too hard at it sometimes, asking different questions on purpose so that they wouldn't be bored with the interview themselves.
Yeah. Why is funeral coverage so popular on C-SPAN? Maybe that's a question you get a lot. I'm trying to think of a question you maybe haven't been asked.
We've always been surprised by how popular, and I don't mean popular, but how funerals are watched by so many people. But I think it makes sense. Let's face it, all of our lives we're thinking about what the end of our life is going to be. And when people die that we know, today they put on quite a show, bringing in people that we know, speaking on their behalf, speaking about their lives. But it's one of the most popular things we do. We don't have ratings, but you can tell from the feedback that people have and the comments that you get afterwards. And we've always commented, not on camera or anything, but you could almost start a funeral channel 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and probably have a pretty good audience.
Cooking channels, funeral channels.
You have cooking, and there's several other kinds of channels you could probably have. You have wedding channel. You could probably do very well with it.
So this is somewhat of a macabre question, but you're looking great. You don't look any different than you did 20 years ago. So I'm not suggesting anything. But
this is not different. I ask this question all the time. So
okay, but at some point down the road there'll be a funeral for you, and how would you like to be remembered?
I have no interest in how I would be remembered. I'm not much of a legacy person. I probably more than anything, I just like to be remembered as basically I did what I said I was going to do in my own particular life. But when I'm gone, it won't matter what anybody says. I'll be gone. And I think the less said, the better. I'm always fascinated by sometimes the way people go on and on about people who have departed. And I've always been fascinated because I was raised a Catholic, and it seems strange to me that you're raised a Catholic, they talk about the importance of your life, but that you are going to die and go to heaven, and why everybody fears the fact that you're going to go to heaven. It seems like that would be the most joyous time of your life, but people mourn the fact that people are gone, but I guess that's just human nature.
So you're politically then, you don't want to be labeled in some way, and you do seem very neutral. Religiously neutral?
I never talk about religion. I never talked about it on the air. I didn't think it was appropriate. I have no objection to anybody else doing it, but again, we try to keep our own personal views of this kind of thing out of what we do on television, because people they want to put on you whatever they think you are or not, and you can't. I've noticed, I've been accused of a lot of things with our call-in shows over the years, and no matter how hard you try to say, but I'm not, people won't believe that. So you're better off just keeping your own personal life out of that, and I've tried to do that for the last 37 years. And
you try to do that even when you're interviewed?
Try to, yeah.
So,
unless I have a probing interview, I can't.
So I was looking at your interview with Shelby Foote. And again, one thing that's good is if there's a term that you think all of your listeners may not be familiar with, you'll ask. So for example, you say to Shelby Foote, define the word emancipation. What does that mean? Which is great interviewing. And it's interesting what he said about it. But then he went on right from there to say, I think history has a plot. You don't make it up, you discover it. Do you have that sense of history?
I never looked at it that way. One of the great joys of my own life has been interviewing historians, because they think a lot about this kind of stuff. And I don't have any deep philosophical views of the world. I really just watch what other people do, and history to me, it seems like we never learn from history. And people always say, well, you can't learn from history because every circumstance is different. But I remember when I first was asking people to support C-SPAN back in 1977, and I asked one of these fellows who ended up being on the board and ran one of the big corporations, I said, my recommendation is we put the House of Representatives on and let people see the entire debate from start to finish. And his immediate reaction was, I think that's a fantastic idea. He, by the way, had said no to every other suggestion I'd made, but he said, I think that's a fantastic idea, because if we'd have had C-SPAN, maybe we wouldn't have had the Vietnam War. Well, there were a lot of people that thought we were never going to do the Vietnam War again. We were never going to make some of the same mistakes. And I think you can find a lot of people that say that the Iraq War was very similar to what happened in Vietnam. That's a subject for bigger experts than I am an expert. But the fact of the matter is that history seems to me to be a learning experience that does make a difference. However, a lot of people don't agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Questions from any of you? And I won't do the C-SPAN thing and ask for Democrat questions or Republican questions. Any questions will do, even balanced questions.
even unbalanced questions,
That's true.
even nasty questions.
So what's C-SPAN's philosophy on what it means to be objective? And I think I recall hearing once about somebody from C-SPAN saying that, people perceive C-SPAN as being very objective, but in fact there are a lot of editorial decisions that go into the whole process. So how does C-SPAN handle that whole question?
There's really no really good, from our standpoint, really good definition of what's objective. I'll give you an example of what we think is objective. You have a Republican Party and a Democratic Party in the United States, those two parties. But there are a lot of people who don't consider themselves either Democrats or Republicans. So our approach to objectivity, and we have the time to do this, is we'll cover the Libertarian Party Convention and the Green Party Convention and the Constitutional Party Convention. And even though those audiences aren't going to be large, give people an opportunity to think outside of those two constraints, namely the Democrats and the Republicans. And we try to do that all the time. I often, my own show that I do, and I still do a show on Sunday nights, will interview somebody because they're not getting any exposure anywhere else and they have an interesting and unusual idea. Objectivity is in the eye of the beholder. There's a lot of it's nuanced. If you go inside both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, you can find, let's say, 6 different types of conservatives: the paleos, the traditionals, the libertarians, and all that. And so it's all very nuanced. And I think people that don't have the kind of time that we have do the best job they can. And I think it's up to us as individuals to watch what is objective and make up your own mind. That's really the principle behind C-SPAN. But we have an editorial board, as you know, Les, every day that make the decisions as to what we cover. And they literally, on days, say, well, we covered this angle yesterday, let's cover this angle today. And they may not even be equal. So it's a toss-up. It's hard. Objectivity is very hard.
What do the Supreme Court and the Gridiron Club have in common?
They won't let cameras in.
Yeah.
I actually just sat in the court yesterday watching an oral argument, which I hadn't been there in several years, and I just wanted to go back and watch it. And I kept thinking to myself how educational it would be with people who can't get to the court, can't get a seat, and not everybody can get a seat for a whole argument, could be able to watch these, because there's nothing unusual about the performance of the people in the room. It's a very well-run organization, but they won't let cameras in. And the Gridiron Club, which is a group of 62 journalists, used to be all print journalists, but now there are television journalists involved in it, and all they do every year is put on one dinner. But that dinner is closed to the press, closed to the television people, and it involves the President of the United States, the cabinet officers, a lot of members of Congress, and people from journalism. And it makes no sense to me that, and I've been to one of these years ago, but it makes no sense that journalists who are always saying that things should be open should conduct a dinner in which they have all the top people in government there and say it's going to be closed because it's their party. But that's what the two of them have in common.
Right. Questions?
Brian, what did you study in college? What?
My major in college was general speech. They did not have broadcasting at Purdue. And I wanted to work the whole time I was in school, and I worked at the local radio station on Saturdays and Sundays. And I didn't really know at the time what I wanted to do except be in the broadcasting business. So I did speech. It was the closest thing to it. If I had it to do over again, I'd do history for the kind of thing that I was involved in, or political science. But I really think history would have been much more useful. But you never know it. When you're that age, you don't really know often what you want to be or what you want to do. But I had a very good state school. I had a very good classical education in liberal arts. And we learned, we had a lot of the basics, the philosophers, the historians, and all that stuff. I always thought I had a good education.
Thank you so much for coming out. It sounds like you've done a lot in your career and a lot of different stuff. What would you say has been the most rewarding aspect of your career?
Learning. It sounds like it's not, all that significant, but it's just, I learned to learn as I got older, and I loved it, and it was it's really the most exciting thing that I do. I didn't know when I was growing up in a small town that traveling would be so important. And so when I got in the Navy was probably the most important thing I've ever done because it changed my whole life. I mean, I got on a ship. I'd never been on a ship before. We traveled overseas on 3 occasions. I got to go to, I think I counted 17 different countries, and that just opened it all up for me. And so that was probably the most important thing I've ever done. But all that led to more and more learning. And if I'm not learning something, I'm bored. And it's my own fault if I'm bored because there's so much to learn, you can't get to the bottom of it all. So I'd say that, and the way you learn often is, as Marvin is talking about here, is you read somebody's book and then you get to sit down with them for an hour, which you'd think you're going to do a lot in your life, but just think of how many times you have not been able to sit down with somebody for an hour and ask them any question you want to ask them. It's really fabulous. And then pass it on to somebody else. So.
Well, let me ask another borderline rude funereal question. Does the thought of, at a certain point, not being able to learn more, all the history going by, but you're not being around to watch it or learn from it, does that bother you?
I don't know that it bothers me, but I do think about it. I mean, you think about, I'm 73 and in good health, but you can't help but watch the world go by, and it goes by. Those of you who aren't 73, I can tell you it goes by faster and faster the older you get. Things just happen quickly. I'm not particularly looking forward to the day when I'm just not involved. I don't have to be involved. I don't have to interview important people or anything like that, but I want to learn. And I'm fortunate that I can still go to C-SPAN every day, have a responsibility there. Not nearly as significant as it used to be, but we have a really good team, fabulous team that has been there for, on average now, about 25 years. And they run it and run it well. But the day that I can't do that anymore, I think is going to be difficult. But I'm trying to talk myself into figuring out ways to make sure that I'm busy when that time happens. I have a lot of friends that are retired, totally hung it up when we got one of my closest friends hung it up when he was 57 years old, and he's the same age as I am. And I ask him probably every time I talk to him, which is at least once a week, how do you do it? I haven't figured it out, but he does manage to do it and has a good time. So yes, the answer is that you think about it, but the good news about today is there's so much available, unlike it was when I was growing up, at your fingertips. I carry it around in my pocket. That I hope to be engaged until I can't anymore.
But I'm not just asking about retirement in terms of jobs. I'm asking about retirement from this world. And does that thought bother you, that you're just not going to be looking at the history is going to go on, the world's going to go on?
It doesn't bother me.
Okay.
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think about it, but it doesn't bother me. I don't sit around in great fear that one day I'm going to be gone. Because I've seen, frankly, too many friends go, and you start to realize that you're just here for a short period of time. And I think probably everybody at this institution thinks about it, talks about it, wonders about it. You can't be sure of anything, but you know that it's going to end someday. Yeah, I mean, I have nobody left in my family. My mother and father and my younger brother has been gone. And then you wake up one day and say, I'm an orphan. So it happens, and you think about it, but I don't dwell on it.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Hannah Czar. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm wondering, you were talking about giving all the sides of the issue, trying to report on all the different angles. Is there any room then for your own personal beliefs to come into play with journalism? Can you ever promote your own side or your own, would that be too biased? As a Christian, can my Christian worldview ever come into play? Or is it more trying to bring balance to all this sides?
You know, I'm sure that my own biases come into, you can't ask, I've done 1,350 interviews that have run Sunday nights for the last 26 years, and for me to say that I've never asked a question because of my own particular bias would be ludicrous. You try to, what we try to do is think about the folks out in the country, and actually in the world because of the internet, and you want them to be able to see all sides. You don't care what somebody says. We don't sit around and say, oh, we're not going to cover that because that's a bunch of Christian fundamentalists. You never do that. I suspect there are some newsrooms that do that, I suspect Marvin could tell you some that he probably is absolutely sure that do that. But we try not to do that on the right or the left. If somebody says to me they're an atheist, I'll take them for what they say, find out why they think that way. And it's the same way if they're Christian or Jewish or whatever their particular religions are. But you cannot, there's no human being that can promise you they're fair, objective, and balanced all the time. You just can't do it. Your own life's experience. I come from a small town, a small family. My father and mother didn't graduate from college. They didn't play classical music in our home. I can go down the list. They didn't read. My mother read fiction, and I read only nonfiction. You just start going down that road, and you'll find out that there's no way that you aren't the product of some existence somewhere that means that certain things are more important to you than others. And I did. Another interesting thing is I didn't get married till I was 63, and most people in this country, if they're going to marry when they're in their 20s. And so as a lifelong bachelor, I'm sure that had some impact on my life. I can tell you that I should have been able to figure this out a long time ago because my wife's so terrific that it would have been probably a real plus. I know it would have been a plus for me to have been married to her for a lot longer. But we've been married 10 years, and it's going well.
And as I understand it, it wasn't that you just met her because you were in the 5th grade, she was in the 1st grade when you met?
Marvin has done such terrific research on this thing. That is absolutely true. My wife and I went to the same grade school, and we dated in the early 70s, and things didn't work out for no major reason. It just didn't work out, circumstantial. And then 27 years later, I found out that I could call her, and she might want to have a meal, and I called her, and we only waited 8 years before we got married. Yes.
Don't want to rush into things.
Don't want to rush into things, yeah. But it's been so good, though, I think it was worth waiting for. I know it was worth waiting for.
Question. If you only had 2 networks you could watch, news networks, CNN or Fox, which one would you watch?
There's not a chance that I'll answer that question.
Sure.
I hope, for goodness sakes, that that's never the case, because I will tell you that I watch both of them, and I watch MSNBC. I'll watch a Sean Hannity or a Bill O'Reilly, and I'll watch a Rachel Maddow and an Anderson Cooper. But I don't know what. That's my job, kind of, to keep track of what's going on. I'll also watch Russia Today and Al Jazeera. And I can go across the dial of Central Chinese television. I love to learn from no matter what the source is, and I love to try to figure out what they're all up to. Because the one thing I can guarantee that the American media is up to is making money. And anybody that doesn't factor that into what they see on television is making a mistake, because that's the reason they're there. If they did not make money, they wouldn't be around for very long. We have the unique situation of not having to make money, but we can't be oblivious to the fact that our industry has to make money. And we don't make decisions based on money because we have no ratings or stars or commercials, but we've had a luxury. And so I'm very sympathetic to the other news organizations because they have to bring home money, and they bring home a lot of money for their companies. But I'm not one of those that bashes one side or the other. I like the fact I've got the choice, and I kind of think I know where they're all coming from, and that makes it very interesting. Thanks for trying.
Let me try to put you on the spot in one other, maybe happier way. I'm suggesting to folks that they go online and look at some of your interviews. Someone who took that recommendation seriously and was going online, is there one particular, of all the interviews, is there one particular one that you'd want them to look at first?
I would go back to that interview that I did with you 20 years ago.
Besides that, of course.
And see whether you and I have progressed positively or negatively.
Okay, second place then.
There isn't one.
Okay.
There really isn't one. Probably the ones that if I had to pick a field that I would go to, would be the historians. There are some absolutely fantastic historians in this country, and we've been able to. I've been able to interview a bunch of them. Our network's been able to cover a bunch of them. And if I were going to go to one particular area, I'd go back to the historians. Frankly, the presidential interviews that were fun and interesting, but the presidents of the United States are interviewed so often, so many different people, that no one interview is going to make that big a difference. But some of these historical interviews, whether it's Richard Norton Smith or Doug Brinkley or David McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, you can go down the list of people. But I really think it would be fun for this group to go back and find the Marvin Olasky interview, because that was a very different time than right now. I haven't gone back to look at it, but I'm going to after this day, just to see how young you look then and how young you look now, and how much hair I don't have that I had then.
So, do you have hand puppets of congressmen?
I do.
And how do you have those?
A young family, the Cressy family, had two young girls. They were probably like 10 and 8, and their father was a C-SPAN junkie, probably still is. One of his daughters came to Washington and worked in a congressman's office, but they made these hand puppets when they were in their 11 or 12 years old, and configured like members of Congress and cabinet officers. I still have them somewhere in my office.
Have you ever felt the temptation to do a puppet show on TV with some of them?
When my brother and I were in grade school, we did puppet shows all the time. I had marionettes, and we used to put on little skits in my mother's bridge club and things like that, and that was probably my first very exciting showbiz. So I should get those out, and that would probably drive somebody I'm interviewing completely crazy if I sat there with the hand puppets on my hands as I'm interviewing them.
So, any last questions from here?
When's the movie start?
So that's whenever the popcorn arrives. So, well, then that's all for today, folks.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Brian for coming.